dari Komplek Balai Budaya Minomartani Ngaglik Salemba. Inilah Radio BBM, Jaringan Radio Komunitas Yogyakarta.
Radio Komunitas Balai Budaya Minomartani. Radio Budaya, Radio Warga, Radio Kita Bersama.
Selamat sore warga budaya, good afternoon cultural citizens. I am Melike and I'm your host for the program Indonesia and Me, where we come together every Friday to discuss my experiences with Indonesia and Indonesian culture and its many, many nuances. Today, we talk about Islam and culturalization of religion. And with me today to discuss this topic, I have Sara L, who studies social sciences at the University of Chicago. Sarah's in Indonesia for her research in Nahdlatul Ulama's global reach in promoting humanitarian Islam, and she's looking at how they're doing this through NGOs in the US. And more specifically, Sarah is looking into the NGOs Lib for All and Baitat Rahmah. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I met Sarah only just yesterday, and we met during the Grebek ceremony in front of Masjid Gede Kauman, in English, Kauman Great Mosque. And this mosque is connected to Kraton, which is the Palace of Yogyakarta, so it's quite a special mosque. And just a bit of context, Grebek is a Javanese term for traditional celebration or carnival. And yesterday, this celebration was around the Islamic holiday Eid. But it can also, so Grebek can also be a celebration for something that is not linked to Islam. In today's podcast, Sara and I will discuss many terms that are new to me, and I'm sure they're new to many of you. So what I will do is to explain the terms, or to at least put in the terms as a comment section in YouTube. And I'll also make a post on Instagram where I explain a bit more on the terms. I think that's the easiest way to go about this, and I hope you can still enjoy the content. So I'll post it on the Instagram Melike the Intern, just to drop that one, and then on the regular BBM YouTube channel. So let's dive into it, and please help me welcome Sara L. Hi, Sara. Welcome to the program.
Hello.
So just to give a bit context to the ones listening, we're currently sitting at a little humble cafe in Intermart and doing the podcast from here. So I hope the sound will be fine, and I hope there won't be too many interfering noises. So Sarah, why don't you start off by telling us about your current research and how it has brought you to Indonesia?
Right, so I'm currently a master's student at the University of Chicago. I'm doing a master's in the social sciences program with an anthropology concentration, and I'm working on my thesis right now. So my thesis focuses on Nahdlatul Ulama's global reach in promoting humanitarian Islam abroad. So I've been focusing on a few of the NGOs by NU in the US, namely Lib for All and Beta Rahma, that were started since the early 2000s by several NU members and a North Carolina native, Holland Taylor. So while I was in the US, I was looking at a partnership between NU and a African-American Muslim community called the Imam Barithuddin Muhammad Community, or IWDM for short, and NU.
Okay.
So I've done part of the field work while in the US at some of the community mosques of IWDM, as well as with some of the conveners and imams of the IWDM community. And here in Indonesia, I've been going around meeting leaders and members of NU, as well as other more local sites like mosques and pondok pesantren in Indonesia.
Okay, interesting. And I also know for a fact that you were initially interested in the Arabization of Islam, you said. That was your initial sort of curiosity and what you wanted to research in your thesis. Where did that interest come from?
Yeah, so a few years ago when I was still doing my bachelor's, I did this year-long internship at the Middle East Institute back in Singapore. This institute is tied to the National University of Singapore, where I was doing my bachelor's degree. And I found that during my time there was this concern among a lot of the researchers and policymakers on this phenomenon called the Arabization of Islam, or what they would call Arabisasi in Indonesia. And what this means, to put it in a very kind of crude way, it's Saudi Arabia's petrodollars financing mosques, schools, and other buildings all over the world. And that has been evident in Indonesia as well. So the concern stemmed from a fear that this influence also meant an export of a certain strand of, say, Salafi Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia, and that was often conflated with this idea of radicalization or terrorism, that on the one hand, many were concerned about, say, like security concerns, but on the other hand, also many were afraid that this more conservative or puritanical strand of Islam would challenge the dominant way in which Islam has been practiced in Indonesia, one that has been more culturalized to take into account local influences, what they would call perhaps Islam Nusantara or archipelagic Islam. So, I mean, during my time there was a lot of talk about Islam Nusantara as a strategy to counter Arabisasi. So I was looking more into this idea of Islam Nusantara, and I eventually found out about these NGOs in the US, and I thought it was a good opportunity to make the most of my time in the US to be able to start some field work while I'm based there, and also do more field work over the summer when I'm in Indonesia. So I guess it's a combination of, it's still somewhat related to what I was interested in then, but also more of a pragmatic decision to look at something that I could handle in terms of scope within the time frame of the master's degree.
Yeah, definitely. That's important. That's a real thing, a real concern. And I'm really curious to hear what, so your motivation for your research, but also sort of from a personal perspective, why is this important to you? Because I hear from you that throughout your experiences, your internship, you've sort of gone through a process of now narrowing it down to, okay, this is what I want to look into. But where did that initial motivation or interest start, and how is that? Where does that come from personally?
I think I would probably trace that to my interest in the Middle East as a region before perhaps more than 10 years ago. If I were to pinpoint a starting point, I probably stumbled upon this emergence of the modern Middle East course on Coursera back when I was maybe about 14 years old. And from then on, just one thing led to another. So there was that course on Coursera, and then I eventually while I was in high school, I took a university level geopolitics course that focused a lot on the Middle East as a region, on nationalism and themes like that. And then subsequently, I visited Israel with a pastor, which obviously had a very different positionality from what I was exposed to on an academic level. And also, I think in that same year or the year after, just my last year of high school, I did do an internship at the Middle Eastern desk at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in Singapore. So I felt that it was a collection of perspectives on the region, and it was just extremely fascinating to me how it's a place where different people who have different stakes, or even people who are not from the region, could have stakes in the region. I mean, a lot of issues become very emotional and cause a lot of polarization. So it was something that I think I found very intellectually curious about and intellectually stimulated. So, which was why I decided to do my first bachelor's degree in Sciences Po in France at the Middle Eastern Focus campus. So all the classes, or almost all the classes, were focused on the region. And everyone on that campus was also equally interested in the Middle East and North Africa as a geographic region. So my bachelor's consisted of 2 years in France and 2 years in Singapore. And while I was very interested in the Middle East and tried to continue my interest back in Singapore during my last 2 years of the bachelor's, I found that even in the Middle East Institute, the focus was very much framed from the perspective of Southeast Asia. So then that influenced my trajectory of research to look more into how the two regions interlace with each other, and how perhaps influences from the Middle East touch the lives or the politics or the economy of Southeast Asia. So that also links to this concept or the phenomenon of Arabization of Islam, and eventually to what I'm looking at right now. So it's been kind of a winding journey to where I am.
Definitely. And I'm curious because you said you went to Israel with a pastor. And that just makes me very curious to hear how that experience was. And in general, so you're also here in Indonesia doing ethnographic research, meaning you're literally in the field. You're experiencing events and ceremonies, religious rituals with the people that you're obviously researching. So I'm very curious to hear some of your significant experiences in the field.
Yeah, I would say that if I were to contrast or compare the two experiences, they're quite different because in the case of going with the pastor to Israel, it was more of something that's a lot more planned. So you have an itinerary every day. You want to cover a few of the holy sites. And it was really rushed because you're going as a big group and you're taking the bus from one place to another. And everywhere we went, I think that was in 2015, it was really crowded. There were a lot of people going there on pilgrimage or just tourism in general. So I felt that I didn't really get much of a chance to interact with people from the place.
I can imagine.
Right, and at that time, I don't think I spoke Arabic as well at that time. So I wasn't really able to communicate in either Hebrew or Arabic with the locals. Whereas now in Indonesia, it's for a very different purpose, and because it's for an academic, ethnographic purpose, a lot of my interactions are relatively unplanned. And even though I have, say, a few people that I want to meet or to interview, a lot of the encounters so far have been rather impromptu, and more of one person opening doors to three more others, and just kind of having a gateway to learn about more things. So it has been great, and I remember one advice that I was given about ethnography a few years ago, which is that to never turn down an invitation, and I've kind of been doing that. I mean, since I've got into Indonesia for about 2.5 weeks now of the 1 month of field work, that I've just been meeting people, and as they open doors, I just followed their lead, and that led me to more and more different discoveries that might or might not be directly relevant to the topic of my research.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm also curious. So here you're saying, well, it's more unplanned. As you're observing, you interact with people. How do people respond to that?
So I mean, there are a few different situations, I would say. So, for example, if I'm interviewing a leader of part of NU, they would obviously be speaking within the capacity of their position within the organization. So I would say that is still more, they're aware of my project. At least I've messaged or reached out to them maybe at least a few days beforehand. As compared to, say, meeting people just randomly. So, for example, last week I was at the Masjid Agung Demak, and I just hung out there for a few days. And one of the days I met this lady in the morning, and I was just talking to her because I saw her close to the entrance of the mosque, and she told me that she is actually the leader of this thing called Sogam Nusantara, which is a volunteering organization that's affiliated with Ganjar, the upcoming presidential candidate. And that was just really interesting. She even had a truck with her picture on it. And there was another lady with her who is the leader of the branch in Batam. And then the same day afterwards, I met with two girls in the mosque, also randomly, who are studying Semarang. The university there. And one of them just graduated, and one of them is still studying the university. And we were just talking, and eventually they told me that there is this bakso place nearby that was really good. So we went together on a becak. And we went over and we had a really long conversation for a few hours, and then we went back again to the mosque. And I think, so usually if I tell them I'm looking at, say, Islam Nusantara or this idea of Islam untuk kemanusiaan, everyone usually has something to say about that. And it could be a range of things, but I think in general, what is common is that they would associate that with values of, say, rahmah, of damai, of like peace and tolerance and love. And these are the values that they associate Indonesian, or how they practice Islam. Those are the things they associate their practice with. Okay. And also, just for our listeners to give some context, so Sara speaks both Arabic and Indonesian, and I find that very, very impressive. And I'm assuming it also gives you a huge advantage in this research, obviously speaking with people here in a language where they can fully, so in Indonesian, obviously in Bahasa, fully express themselves how they want. What do you think that gives you, say, versus having to speak English in the community? I think that definitely helps. I mean, I'm not completely fluent in Bahasa Indonesia yet.
No.
But I think being here, it's also about being ready all the time, because sometimes I'm not sure if the interview is going to be in English or in Indonesian, and it's just having to be ready to kind of be able to translate on the spot and to know perhaps some of the keywords that are important to my research. And maybe over time also keywords that pop up a lot on their end to know what they mean and to prepare for that. And I think over a week or two, the practice has definitely helped make me a lot more comfortable in speaking the language.
I can definitely imagine. And so we've talked a bit about your ethnographic encounters or experiences. Is there something that has really surprised you, or something that you didn't expect, and that has maybe even shifted the focus of your research, or maybe it has just personally affected you in one way or another?
I think there are two main points, perhaps, that are quite unrelated. The first thing was following a first lead that I wasn't aware about before. So when I was in Semarang, I visited the Masjid Agung Jawa Tengah. And I met with...
And just for our listeners, do you mind just specifying what that is?
It's the Great Mosque of Central Java in Semarang, which has a really interesting architectural style, merging being an acculturation of like the Arab, the Javanese, and the Greek styles. So just visually, it's a great sight when you look at it. So I also didn't know anyone when I was there, and I just walked into the office and I met with the PR manager, and he was telling me about some connections that the mosque had with universities in China. So that was something really interesting and new to me. And I followed that lead and met someone else he recommended. And then from there, I met a few other people who themselves studied in China for their university education. And I even went to Probolinggo, where the Pondok Pesantren Nurul Jadid is located, because that is a Islamic boarding school and high school that is known for their many alumni having gone to China for university, having received scholarships from there. So that was perhaps a side project that I stumbled upon during my time here, just following a lead to another. So that was particularly interesting, just to think about as a story of mobility, perhaps, because a few of them mentioned that for the average person, it's relatively hard to even imagine going to university, and therefore with a scholarship, wherever it brings them to, even to China, which some of them may have had negative impressions about, that's something they would want to embark on. And on another level, one of them started this initiative called the Nusantara Institute, which links Chinese companies and individuals in Indonesia and China to facilitate people-to-people connections. So I think it also demonstrated how a lot of the perhaps diplomatic connections are not done on an institutional level, but on a people-to-people level. And that's also reflected in some of the observations I had on my main project, where the NGOs that were founded by NU members in the US, they were not really first done on with an institutional capacity, but more of a people-to-people individual level, and then it became more institutionalized over time. And yet another separate observation would be perhaps the focus on the economy on many levels, from talking to my interlocutors here. So be it at the Wahid Foundation or at the LKIS in Jogja, both institutes, the members of the institutes there was a strong message that there's a belief that the economy is closely tied with the idea of like peace and tolerance in terms of religious tolerance. So there is a belief that with a better economic status, people would be more prone to being peaceful and tolerant, inter-religious wise, although the mechanics of that was not really explained very clearly to me. But I think that's a common theme that I've seen and I've experienced talking to various interlocutors within Indonesia as compared to perhaps some of the more the messages that are more of an ideological level when promoting ideas of, say, Islam Nusantara or humanitarian Islam and ideas like that are not necessarily rooted in material money in the Marxist sense of the word, but more of a discourse level. So there's a little bit of that difference in observation that I had.
And what you're saying about sort of tolerance or interreligious tolerance, it reminds me a bit of Pancasila. And I did a podcast on Pancasila. So just a quick reminder to our listeners, Pancasila is the 5 pillars that are together the foundation of sort of a cohesive Indonesian, ideology. And one of them is very much about tolerance and diversity. And I think sort of throughout Indonesian ideologies, I think it becomes very apparent and very clear that tolerance, interreligious tolerance in terms of diversity in general is very important for this country. So it's interesting to me that you're saying, well, that is also important here. And in fact, so what I understand from you is you're saying the belief is that the more materially wealthy people get, the more tolerance they will have interreligiously. And my next question would indeed be how, but that's exactly what you said very, very nicely as a disclaimer. Well, those mechanics also weren't very clear to me, because I wouldn't necessarily immediately understand those mechanics or that logic. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it would be something definitely more interesting to look into. But I know that an example from the Wahid Foundation would be this peace village that they do.
Okay.
So they do train, say, women or people in the villages to be to be part of a small medium enterprise in terms of training them with certain skills and then empowering them to sell certain products that they make. So that is again underpinned by that assumption that with more, I guess, an advancement in your economic status, you would also be able to move towards tolerance or interreligious harmony. So that's one of the efforts that they have.
And Sarah, can you sort of just in your own words explain why do you think it's so important to have interreligious tolerance? Why is it important to promote that? So either to you or why do you think it's important to Indonesia?
I think we can think of the worst case scenario or what happens as an opposite or a counter to that, which is a lot of what I think NU is trying to fight against. Be it, say, the extreme case being, say, terrorism or exclusivism. And that touches all levels of our lives. Be it in terms of, say, the social fabric of society or our politics, having very exclusivist politics. We see that, I mean, in Europe, we see that in America. The rise of, say, right-wing parties that are promoting a lot of a perhaps so-called nationalist agenda with a exclusivist rhetoric. And I think that does touch on the lives of people in general. And because it permeates so many levels of our lives, it's important to look for ways to get to this state of harmony, even if it's always a work in progress. Yeah, no, definitely. You said it very beautifully. Thank you for that. And what I hear from you is that obviously during your research, you meet so many different people and you touch so many different stories and subtopics for your
distinguish between this goes in my research, this doesn't have room in my research for now. It's interesting, but I will leave it. I mean, how do you? So I'm curious to hear you struggle with that, and how do you find your way out of it?
Yeah, I would say that I'm still not totally out of it right now. I mean, I'm definitely still in the weed of doing my field work and research and trying to put together something coherent for my thesis.
Yeah.
But I think something that I do is to try to write everything I notice down and to do it immediately or quickly after I've had an encounter with someone. I would go back to write in my notebook, be it pen and paper, or type it out and try to at least have something down, because I think, well, memory is always fallible, and if I were to think back what happened, say, a week ago, with so many things happening, I'll probably not be able to really capture what I felt or what I encountered then. So at least with that point of reference, I have as much material as I can. And then it's a lot easier to go through them and see some common threads across that are relevant to my area of focus, or points that stand out or challenge some of my assumptions before.
I definitely recognize that. So I'm also going to do my internship, and I need to do write a report back home about my reflections. And I'm also very tightly journaling, because not only do you not remember what happened, but you get used to it. So what I experienced in the beginning of my stay, I've been now in Jogja for somewhere between 6 and 7 weeks. What I found surprising back then, what I found interesting, what I found different or particularly beautiful, those things have become normal now, so I don't notice them as much. And that is really something I recognize is so important to journal it down. So not so much for the factual points, but even more so for like the emotional encounters and experiences you have and how they surprise you. And then when you read back, that's what I'm doing now. Sometimes I'm reading back and I think, oh yeah, that also says so much about me that it surprised me, or that was a new experience to me. And that I find even more interesting than the experience, but how I am reacting to that experience. And that's really also what I'm trying to journal down. So yeah, I can imagine, very interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
And then just what I'm curious about. So we obviously, Sarah, we met just yesterday, and we met at the Grabek ceremony. And just for our listeners that don't know what that is, Grabek is a Javanese term for traditional celebration of carnival. So this is a very sort of generic explanation, and how we experienced it yesterday was for the Eid celebration yesterday. And how I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Grabek can be for an Islamic event or ceremony, but also for something that is not necessarily Islamic, but more Javanese, so it can be Javanese New Year. But anyhow, so we met at the Grabek ceremony yesterday. We saw the march, and I'm curious what you took from that. Obviously, you were there doing your field work, ethnographic research, observations. So I'm curious to hear what you took with you from that ceremony.
Yeah, it was my first time witnessing that ceremony too, so it was a new experience for me. And so the first time I heard of Grabek was when I was in Demak, because it's a place that's known for their Grabek Bazaar. But the days that I was in Demak, they did not have that ceremony. It happened, I think, a few days before I arrived and a few days after I left. So something they told me was that the mountain of rice that they would bring around during the festival is for the Songo, which is rooted in the idea of the Wali Songo, or the saints that they believe brought Islam to Indonesia.
The 9 saints, I believe.
So although when I was there, they also had some disputes over whether it's actually 9 people or that 9 of them were part of actually a parliament representing a lot more of them. So there was a scholar who was telling me that there are actually hundreds of them, and 9, they know it as 9 because the 9 from the parliament. So there's still some debate surrounding that.
Maybe it's also just easier to say 9. Sometimes when the story goes on and passes generation to generation, 9 is an easy number. So maybe that is it.
And the phrase is something that's so well known among
definitely.
people in and out of Indonesia. So when they were telling me about it, they always told me it's something cultural, and it seemed like they did not immediately associate the practice with something religious.
Yeah. So the Grebek Bazaar, they didn't necessarily connect to something religious. Okay.
Even though it obviously happens during the Eid, and also in the month. Say in this month, they do have concerts and a carnival every day that is also part of this Grebek Bazaar, although the ceremonies itself only happen on certain dates a few times, I think about 3 times perhaps in the whole month. So it was definitely great to be able to see it and to be in a space that is connected so significantly. I mean, at the Kraton, to the masjid being so significant culturally, and also being here in Jogja. That was a great experience, and I'm glad that I got to witness it during my field work here.
Definitely. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about Demak, if you want to share, because obviously I know you've been there. You just mentioned it now as well. And how is Demak different from Jogja, and why did you go for your research?
Yeah, so Demak, I would say, is a lot less busy than Jogja, because Jogja is much more urban, much more of a city. Demak I chose it as a site because about 10 years ago, the NGO Beta Rahma, or perhaps it was Lip for All, I believe it was Beta Rahma, published a documentary about Islam Nusantara, and they featured the Masjid Agung Demak, the Great Mosque of Demak, as a main site where the Islamization of Java happened. Okay. So I chose it as a site.
I can imagine.
Mainly based off the documentary. And again, I did not really know anyone from Demak before I went there.
No.
But it was just really amazing that the day before I went to Demak, I was in Semarang and I met with the leader of the PWNU Central Java. And he immediately called his friend who was in Demak the day right after our meeting. And so
impressive.
That night itself, when I arrived in Demak, the friend met me, and the next day, he and 2 other friends brought me all around to different sites. The grave of Sunan Kalijaga, the grave of the first rulers of Demak, the Masjid Agung Demak, and also to several other scholars that are researching Wali Songo and the history of Islamization of Java.
Right. Interesting. It's such a great example of just diving into it head first and then meeting obviously great people on your way, and then one thing leads to another. I think that's such a spark of motivation for anyone listening who's like, I want to research this, but how do I go about it? Or I want to travel, but I don't have experience, I don't have a network yet. And I think, Sarah, you're just proving that an open mind and networking skills, which I'm sure you have, for this to be successful, you can do it. It's very impressive.
Yeah, I was a little concerned, especially when I was in Semarang, because I had no connections there at all.
No.
I think really just walking into places and just perhaps turning up at offices. If anyone's available there, most of the time they would be happy to talk to you and to perhaps connect you with other people that are relevant for the project.
Definitely. And you say, well, you also had concerns, which I can imagine 100% I would as well. How do you overcome those concerns? How do you tell yourself, well, I'm concerned, but I'm going to do it either way?
Yeah, I think it was great that I accompanied my friend last year who's a PhD student.
Okay.
I came with her to Jogja last July, and she was doing a field recce, so she studies disaster management.
Okay.
And Jogja was one of the potential sites because she was interested in Mount Merapi and the volcanic eruption and how communities surrounding that kind of recover from a disaster. So that trip itself was pretty significant because on one of the days we were supposed to meet with someone from the disaster management office, and the morning itself, he didn't turn up, and only later on we realized that his mother passed away. So he was the person who had the contacts of all the other people we were going to meet in the day. So we literally had
he was obviously grieving then.
Right. So we couldn't contact him. We had no plan for the day, and she just walked into the office, and there was this guy who gave us a tour of. It was kind of a museum of the, like, where they measured the seismic activities of the volcano. And she was telling him about her project, and he just said that he knew this village head that at a pretty new village by Merapi, and he just called him, and the village head said he was free. So we just went there right after, and it was all unplanned, and things just came together just by talking to people and them connecting her with others. So I think with that in mind, I knew that there would possibly be ways to go around not knowing anyone, and I just gave it a shot by walking into the office to talk to someone from there.
Yeah, definitely. So you had a bit of sort of almost like a mentoring experience last year. Oh, that's great. And I just quickly wanted to make a comment to something else you mentioned. We talked about the Grebek and how that is sort of now a combination between Islam and Javanese traditions. For me, so I'm also Muslim. We're practicing Islam in my family, and it's super interesting, obviously, to experience something like this because I am obviously totally new to Grebek, and there it is as part of an Islamic celebration. So I'm curious if you've come across as well other experiences of this merge between local culture, local traditions, and Islam anywhere else you've been.
I mean, in my fieldwork here, a good example would be they're visiting what they call berziarah to graves, be it of the Wali Songo or graves of respected people. So in Semarang, there is this Kiai Soledarat, which has a grave there, and there are always many buses every day from all over, mainly from Java, but also other parts of Indonesia that visit to kind of go on a pilgrimage to the graves there. And I think I'm going back to your question on this mixture. I've used that word once, like champur, when I was interviewing someone, and he very quickly corrected me by saying it's not a mix, but he considers it as what Gus Dur, former president of Indonesia, would call pribumisasi, kind of these like culturalization of Islam to local practices. So it's kind of a bit different, I guess, in that it's not religion and culture, but that it is still as authentic a form of Islam according to them, just that there are also certain existing cultural practices that are that have shaped the way they practice Islam.
What was the word again?
Pribumisasi.
Pribumisasi. And how I understand it is a bit that it is integrating the religion into the local practices. Would that be a way of understanding it? So again, just briefly again, what is the difference between mixing culture and religion and what you said, culturalization, or how did you express it?
I think they would say it's a form of, I think the main contention is on authenticity, and they're saying that it's their Islamic practice is as authentic as in, say, the Arab world or in any other place.
That it's not any less
authentic, even though there are cultural aspects, like the visiting of graves and practices like that.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thank you for sharing that. That's really important nuance, I think, to understand. We have to wrap up. I think I could ask you a trillion more questions, but I know you have a busy schedule. You have family visiting, and you're going to experience a batik workshop, I believe. Yeah. So I will be wrapping up. And my question to you, Sarah, is obviously, so you're here doing the field research. You're here doing ethnographic research in Indonesia. I believe you're going back to Singapore to see family, and then the journey goes to the States in Chicago, where you're doing your master. I'm curious to hear what you hope that your master will contribute to or contribute with, and how this master is important to you personally.
Yeah. So a large motivation for me in doing this master's was to be able to experience something on the ground through ethnographic work. And part of my intervention, part of my hope is to intervene within the security sector that often takes a relatively blanket approach towards issues like radicalization or terrorism.
A blanket approach. What do you mean by that?
So, be it going back to this idea of, say, the Arabization of Islam, there is very little nuance in that analysis. There are certain analysis saying that just because, say, women are having heavier veiling practices or using more Arabic words, therefore it is a concern, and that it's something that we should be looking into. And I think the very premise of the security sector is that you cannot risk anything. You rather over securitize than under it. So I think it's important in our analysis to be precise and not to always try to over securitize something, because that in turn can lead to a lot of fear mongering, which is not something that is ideal either.
No.
And knowing where to draw that line and having that balance is something that I don't think I have really seen. Coming from the private security sector before, it's something that's extremely difficult to do, especially when your own job is also on the line, because if you don't, say, escalate an issue, it could be a real concern, not just for your company or your client, but also for yourself. Definitely. If something really happens. And I think knowing where that precision comes from is really important, and being on the ground has been extremely eye-opening and helpful to move me towards that direction.
It almost reminds me of something that was very commonly said a few years back, which was that the fear of terror has become the fear of each other. And that is a bit how I understand what you're saying. Well, we're so overly concerned with security for good reasons, but that over concern, because it's not always totally up to speed in terms of education, I guess, or in terms of knowledge. It sometimes overgeneralizes, I guess. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Sara, for meeting with me in this humble cafe in Indomart. It has been such a pleasure. It has been super interesting. Is there anything we haven't touched upon yet that you want to address?
Well, it's been really nice chatting with you as well, and I think our conversation can go on for much longer, but for now, I think I'll leave it as it is. Hopefully we'll have more time to chat in the future.
I hope so. I really hope so. Thanks a lot again, and Warga Budaya, if you have questions for Sara or for me, you can always ask it in YouTube, and we'll try our best to accommodate. Terima kasih Warga Budaya for listening and for being curious. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and I hope you've learned from it. I know it has been heavy in content, heavy in new words and terms, but I hope you'll find a way to digest it and take it in. For the rest, have a great night, Warga Budaya, dan sampai jumpa di siaran berikutnya. Bye-bye.
Dari Komplek Balai Budaya Minomartani Ngaglik Rempo, inilah Radio BBM, jaringan radio komunitas Yogyakarta.